Most of us grow up thinking that truth is about integrity, that it's a personal choice, that it somehow represents a high sense of self knowledge, acceptance, and worth, that it is a marker of how good or bad we are, or how brave and courageous we are. But no one tells you that truth is expensive, and that for most of human history, human beings actually couldn't afford to be truthful. For most of human life, human beings were controlled by the truth of the larger cosmos. And not to say that that isn't true now, but for most of human life, we only told the truth when it was safe to do so. And we performed what was acceptable for the rest of the time. Not because we were fake, but because we were building systems and institutions and a society at large that wasn't about truth telling, that wasn't about authenticity, that wasn't about us being who we really are, but about survival. So when we talk about truth, and I know I'm not the only one, but when we talk about being honest or being truthful in the world that we live in, something about it feels very fake. Something about it feels very hypocritical. And because in some sense it is. And in this video, I'm going to explain why that is and how finally in this time in human history, we have the privilege of safety, resources, and knowledge that makes truth a viable option to practice. This video has nothing to do with romanticizing honesty or authenticity, but trying to understand why it's so hard to be honest and why it's been so easy to lie about what we really feel or think or how we want to exist. The first thing to understand here is that we didn't really start off as spiritual beings. In fact, we're only learning to grow into being truly spiritual beings with the advent of the raves in 2027. We actually started off as survival machines. The five-centered human being was a human being that relied entirely on the larger program and was receptive entirely on the larger program in order to survive and reproduce and continue being on this planet. And with the advent of the seven-centered beings came more autonomy, in a sense. Came this ability to be able to be strategic in their thinking. The seven-centered being was a purely strategic being, meaning that it could take advantage of what it was focused on by storing and using its memory. The seven-centered beings didn't wait for clarity. They didn't wait to be aligned. They scanned for threat. They were highly defensive beings. They reacted to their environment and adapted to it, and over a period of time developed strategies in order to survive, in order to reproduce more and more, and form tiny alliances that help them progress further in their survival journey. The seven-centered being found the fastest way to gain power, to gain advantage, to gain resources, and to stay on top of all of it. This wasn't dysfunction for the seven-centered being, it was their design. And in some sense, we can say that survival was the seven-centered being's honest truth. That's what it was designed for. That's what it was here to do for the humankind. Unlike us, for them, it wasn't about expressing their individuality. It was about not getting exiled from the tribe. It was about not being deported from the country. It was about not finding yourself in jail. It was about conforming so you could be supported and could be part of the material society. Actually, when we understand human design cosmology, we understand that lying was a necessity. Lying in order to gain an advantage or in order to gain power or in order to gain status was a necessity. That's what the world demanded. As Ra likes to say, the seven-centered world was not designed for correctness. It was designed for control. Another important thing to understand here is that not only the seven-centered being was strategic in its awareness, was strategic in its orientation, but also that every seven centered being had a mutated larynx. Human beings went from grunting and signaling and using primitive methods to communicate with each other to speech. The throat center, in connection to the ajna, allowed human beings to now articulate and speak and communicate to each other complex patterns and strategies that they came up with. This was revolutionary because for the first time in human history, the mind didn't just think alike. It gave it language, it gave it a story, it gave it legitimacy, it gave it the power to spread across tribes, across regions. Now human beings could say things they didn't mean because they thought it would benefit them or because it would give them an advantage over someone else. And in fact, they began being rewarded for being strategic. The performance of truth became more important than actually being truthful about things. Just take a moment to think about how that shaped society. Speech made religion possible, myth, morality, confession, organizations, rules, contracts, all of that is hinged on our ability to say things with certainty, whether or not they were truthful, whether or not they were real, but to say them as if they were. This means that for our predecessors, truth was not only unnecessary, but also disadvantageous. You could say, I believe in God without believing in anything and be protected by a larger body. You could say, I do at the altar and stay fed whether or not you were actually committed. You could say, I'm happy, I'm grateful, I'm good, and never be rejected. Human beings build entire civilizations on strategy, in which speech was the currency and lie became the most efficient form of being wealthy. A good liar could rise because a good liar was able to take advantage of what was in front of it. Ra says when the larynx mutated, the mind became audible, but the body still held the truth and no one was listening. Speech gave the lie form, and with form came power, but not correctness. The ajna is not here to decide, it is here to observe. When it pretends to guide, it creates illusion. And that's exactly the world that we live in. Once lying became language, taking advantage became common, it didn't just stay personal, it became institutional. We built entire systems that required people to lie in order to function, not because they were corrupt, but because they were based on strategic survival to begin with. Schools, in the name of biology and English and math, taught us language. They never really taught us how to work with our individual awareness. Marriage taught us that staying together was more noble than actually being honest about how you feel. Religions taught us that if we confessed or carried on our rituals and prayed in the temple every Tuesday and offered the gods some sweet offering, that we were good, that we were clean, that we were pure. Workplaces taught us that we needed to override our own energy level in order to be part of something bigger, in order to be truly productive. Social roles, woman, mother, son, daughter, they all came with scripts. And the better you performed those scripts, the more you were celebrated. Human beings in the history of humanity have never been taught to be honest. We have been taught to be consistent. We have been taught to be agreeable. We have been taught to build identities around what is expected of us rather than being authentic. Ra says, the world you see is not built on truth. It is built on patterns of control, and the only way to survive it was to adopt them. The cost of honesty in the age of the tribe was exile, and no one can afford to be exiled when the world is tribal. We made lying normal by making conformity sacred. But something has changed amongst humanity. Something has changed very quietly, very discreetly, without making a lot of external noise. Human beings stopped being seven-centered beings in 1781 and started to show up as nine-centered beings. This wasn't philosophical, this was mechanical, a shift in our energetic structure, a shift in the way that our genes operated and how much access we had to our genetic material, a shift in our auras, a shift in our cognition. Human beings' mind was finally dethroned, and for the first time, we were designed to have inner authority that resided in our physical body. The truth no longer lived in mental strategy, but in the energy that the sacral released or didn't release, or in the instinct that the spleen had or didn't have, or the clarity that an emotional being got over a period of time or didn't in the moment. In essence, nine centered beings were the first human beings that could, in a very deep, enhanced way, feel what was right for them or not. And it wasn't entirely dependent on survival. As nine centered human beings were a combination of strategic and receptive awareness. Our existence is not merely about our survival, but also about our ability to be receptive to the world around ourselves, and not just to take advantage of it, but to just be a part of it, just to exist with existence itself. Being receptive is not about having precision focus in order to take advantage of something. It's about being in communion with something as you are, without pretense, without editing. But there is a catch. Just because our energetic makeup changed and the human beings that started to show up on the planet were nine centered beings designed for unique awareness and authenticity, doesn't mean that the world we showed up in was set up for us, was set up for honesty. Our bodies changed, but the world that we were born into didn't. The system, governments, institutions, hospitals, schools, universities, religion, they are all still running on seven centered logic. Obey, perform, produce, conform, fit in. But now suddenly we have bodies that say, that isn't me. That doesn't feel right. That is harming me. That feels like self abandonment. I wonder when I do the right thing, nothing feels right about it. This is the friction that all of us feel. Because for the first time, we have mechanics to be honest, but we're still stuck in systems that cannot hold our honesty, that are not designed for our honesty. So telling the truth of who we are and being the truth of who we are is now a mere possibility, but it's not a necessity. In fact, it's very difficult. And you and I know this. Anybody that's in their deconditioning journey or that tries to express themselves authentically in the world and goes against the norm understands that this is the hardest thing that you could probably do, because you have centuries and centuries of systems that stand against it, that don't support it, that fight your honesty and even punish it. The world still rewards what's convenient. And that's the tension that we're living in as human beings right now. To be who you are and risk everything, or to keep pretending and feel your life drift out of alignment, one performance at a time. Ra says in 1781, the mutation split us from the past. We became beings of awareness, but we still live among ghosts. You have a truth inside you, but the world is not built to listen. That is why correctness is not safe, but it is necessary. The age of the mind is over, but the mind doesn't know that. It still thinks it's in charge, and that's where all the lies begin. And look, I want to end this video with being as honest as I can. Even with everything that I know, I still lie. Not in the obvious way, in the way that I'm fabricating my entire life or living some kind of a double life. But sometimes I say yes when I can feel in my body that I'm not really up for something. I still soften the truth so it can land better sometimes. I still smile to keep things easy, even when my body wants to shut down. And very often, as I'm living my life, I find myself witnessing and noticing this isn't me. Something feels off. Because here's the uncomfortable truth: lying is still easier. Being who you are is the hardest thing you can do in the world that we live in. And not because I want to deceive or I want to manipulate, but because being yourself comes at a cost. And I know Ra talks about your signature, that as you live as yourself more and more, that you experience me as a projector, more sweetness, more success. And while that is so true, but it also comes with its own kind of resistance. And maybe it's not physical resistance, maybe it's not my body having its red siren on, but the truth is, we still live in a world that doesn't reward authenticity. Regardless of it being hard, we realize there's no escaping from our differentiation, our uniqueness. You can no longer lie and get away with it. Not physically, not energetically. Our bodies are no longer designed to hold false mental identities. But here's the part that's important to discuss. Here's where the grace is. You don't have to get it perfect. You just have to notice. Because noticing is where the lie begins to lose its grip. And that is the start of becoming authentically wild and free. And I wanted to end with this quote that I really love by Ra, obviously. The tragedy is not that we lie, it's that we don't recognize when we do. Awareness begins the moment we admit it. You're not here to be perfect. You're here to notice when you're not being you. And that is the real awakening.